All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Jens Bodal, as you heard earlier. I'll be talking with you about using the Upgrade module, which I guess is now the old way of upgrading your application from the different way. Still valid, migrating to Angular from AngularJS. And the main focus is on setting your application up. You can call it a hybrid application if you want, but basically running Angular and AngularJS side by side and basically being able to enable yourself to upgrade piece by piece services and components into Angular. The main focus is again also going to be on rewriting these components into Angular. You do have the ability to upgrade services and components, and also but just see better ways just to kind of focus on rewriting and then downgrading. The slides that you're seeing here are the second link. On the GitHub repo, the Angular Seattle GitHub, there's an extremely detailed guide that goes into way more detail than I'll be covering here. I'll still be going over quite a bit of detail, but as verbose as possible, I put the guide up. So it's quite long, but it covers each step that's covered here as far as adding the Angular library, bootstrapping AngularJS from Angular, what I did to modify the build process that kind of mimics the production builds that we use at McGraw-Hill on my team. An example of downgrading a component. I take one of the components that was written in AngularJS and it's rewrite it in Angular, as well as an example of adding an Angular route. So I'll be showing some parts of the guide here throughout, but just kind of I'll be going over the bullet points and showing kind of the parts that I feel that matter. So the first thing though I'm going to do is, this is just a basic AngularJS application that doesn't really do much, but it's built using John Papa's style guide, so it's extremely decomposed. Each part is, the template is separate from the controller, separate from the spec files, which there's no unit test for this one, but from the services. And so basically what it is you put in a URL of a GitHub page. The data is currently mocked, but if you go in, you can change the backend to actually make the actual calls. You put in a base tag, a head, and then you can basically list the files that are in the differences between those two branches, and then you can compare them. And then down below, my screen is extremely zoomed in, so this isn't going to fit all the way, but basically then it'll just kind of list the diff of those two branches for that file and show the patch down here at the bottom for what the change was for that file. There's also just kind of a silly page here that's just written in AngularJS, but it heavily relies on change detection, there's a lot happening every time there's a digest cycle. So a random letter is just appended to a string. Every letter is a different color, and every other letter is capitalized. And every single change, it runs a cycle on that. So just kind of to show what can happen when you start bootstrapping a hybrid application and kind of the problems that can show up. So also keep in mind that if you have any questions, I have 3 Angular patches to give away to first 3 questions, and you can feel free to ask questions at any point or at the end. So I have those, and then I also have some ngconf stickers to give away as well after the patches. So, all right. Just a quick thing, this data was taken before the meetup. I think some people responded to the URL I sent out, but I just kind of give a glimpse or kind of a snapshot of the attendees today. About half of you are actively using Angular, about a quarter of you are actively using AngularJS. Keep in mind that these can overlap. About a fifth of you are currently interested in upgrading your AngularJS application to Angular, and about 8% of you are currently already doing so. Also, AngularJS refers to all versions before Angular 2. Angular refers to all versions after Angular 2. We're already soon to be on Angular version 5. So just kind of, I think that's kind of been nailed into everyone's head at this point, but just another reminder. Also, so all the versions in my application are fixed. So I recommend if you're kind of following step by step to stick with these fixed versions and only upgrade them as you deem necessary. I have tested with the latest version of Angular 4 as of about a week and a half ago. It worked fine, but I just kept everything at 4.22 because there's no need for me to upgrade and risk something else breaking. And there was also, there's one fix I had to push through all the steps that you might see in the README because of some dependency issue I had with Grunt. And so that shows up in every single pull and every single branch difference that's on the guide. And then as well, there's a bug fix that's also pushed to just the master branch, which you might see with that last page I showed you in the app. So we're gonna get started. So starting point, we are gonna basically, I'm gonna open this guide here in hopefully a new page. Let's try that again. So this is the guide I was talking about. Step 0, just a starting point of the base AngularJS application. There's not really much to show here other than that working. And I improperly showed you actually the master branch here, so. And with any luck, we will. So what I meant to show you was this version, which is basically the same, just not running upgrade. There's no Angular components or routes or anything going on here. So keep in mind, this is kind of a legacy AngularJS application. So it's using Grunt for the build tools. It's using Bower for managing the front-end dependencies. It's using NPM for managing the back-end dependencies. And you'll kind of just see how we start kind of integrating in Angular's build process into our existing application. So first step is, and for step 1, I'm not going to type out each step here, so we'll just kind of show you it and then skip to that step and go to the more interesting stuff. But basically what you're going to be using is you're going to be leveraging the Angular CLI to essentially just create an empty Angular application. It's going to generate a bunch of scaffolding code for you, some components and templates, and basically a hello world application. You're just going to basically kind of ignore that stuff, and you're just going to take some of the configuration parts out of there and then use those to then make your application a hybrid application. So there's a few other files that you'll use later, especially if you're going to start integrating protractor tests, other end-to-end testing, functional testing, or Karma for your unit tests. I'm not going to go over, we do have unit testing working with our hybrid application that we're using. It was a bit beyond what I was able to put together for this presentation, however. If you have questions about that, please reach out to me and I'm happy to talk with you about that. So the main files you're going to need is the Angular CLI JSON file. This is basically the configuration file for the Angular CLI for when you use the ng command line. The tsconfig.json, that's the base TypeScript configuration file. It basically tells TypeScript where stuff is and what to do. tslint.json is your linter for TypeScript. The source directory, we're going to move that into our AngularJS application next to our AngularJS source code. And I'm just going to rename it to ngSource just to differentiate it. So as you can see here, this is the current file structure that we have here. There's a source directory, client directory. I have the server code in here as well. I'm not going to touch on that at all. It's just a basic Node.js server that's serving up the app. And then you have app, and then basically, as I said, all the files are decomposed out here into the layout, the GitHub module, the core module, and pure AngularJS module, and some shared services and directives and stuff that I have in here. So the first change, so basically for the Angular CLI.json and the tsconfig, basically for the first 3 files, the main thing you're updating is the paths to the source directory, because we're basically moving it from your repository root directory, and I'm moving it into the source/client/ngSource directory. This is not a necessity to do. It was just simply because of the way we had it, basically the way, it's just showing you that it can be done. So if you do want to move the location of your folder to maybe fit with the way your application is currently set up, I mean, you could very well be running an Angular application alongside a React application and what have you. So depending on how your use is, it should be able to fit your needs. You can make it flexible. So the other thing you're going to be doing is you're going to be taking all of the dependencies are listed in the Angular package.json file, and you're going to be basically merging those into your existing application's package.json file so that you have the needed dependencies to run Angular. And I gloss over this command here, but basically the command you're looking for is you install the Angular CLI, and then you do ng new, just any app names, demo app, and then use skip install because there's no need to install the dependencies to the Angular application since you're just going to be grabbing some of the files there. And then hopefully everything works. So when you get to that point, but I'll show you what happens at that step. So I'm going to go out here. Oops. I'm going to check out that branch. And then also let me go back to here. So one other thing in the guide, at the top of each step, you'll see this comparison link. And basically, we'll just show you the differences that were done between step 1, step 0, step 2, step 1, etc. This step is going to have quite a lot of file additions because there's all this code that I added from the source directory with the app component and all this stuff that was added. But you'll basically see the Angular CLI.json and just kind of some other files that are in here. So just something to keep in mind as you're going through the guide. So I checked out. So now we're at where the application was at. We've basically added Angular to our AngularJS application, and right now it just exists as a completely separate application. So all we've done is just say we now have Angular existing alongside our AngularJS application, and we can build it. It has absolutely no correlation with our current app. If I run grunt and run things, nothing will change because we haven't done anything yet to start integrating it. And that's what I will show you next. So what we're going to do is we have Angular running alongside our AngularJS application. And what you're going to do is you're basically going to say, tell Angular, you're going to, instead of bootstrapping AngularJS from the index.html with your ng-app directive, or if you're using JavaScript to bootstrap it, you're going to tell Angular to bootstrap your AngularJS application and to pass everything over. So, and that kind of looks like this. You have your index.html file. You load your AngularJS libraries as before. You're going to load the bundles that the ng-build command creates. And then those bundles are then going to say to boot up Angular. Angular boots up, and then in the constructor for the app module, that's where you're going to say, hey, I want you to take the document body and bootstrap AngularJS. And then AngularJS will start up, and everything will kind of more or less function as before, except for the issue that Mike kind of touched on, and I'll touch on later. There are some immediate issues that you have, especially if you use Angular material. I don't know, can you guys see this okay from where you are, the code? Okay, well, I'll take that as yes. Basically what you're going to do, so what it looked like before is we had, probably would have been good to show that. Basically before you had the body with ng-app, body ng-app. I can just type it in here. That's not going good. So what was before is you had body ng-app, and this basically said bootstrap AngularJS and continue as normal. What we're going to change is you're going to remove that ng-app, and instead you're going to just add in, by the way, I'm using UI router for handling the router for the AngularJS application. I'm not too familiar with the AngularJS router that comes with that, but I think it has a similar notion of views. So in UI router, it's UI views. So you basically put that piece in, and then the routing part of UI router will say, know how to handle the views from there using further setup. But the same kind of concept is used in Angular. You use a router outlet. Once the router outlet is found and it knows to process the URL, it then looks for a matching route and then loads whatever is supposed to be loaded from that matching route. So what we're going to do is not bootstrap Angular here, just leave everything as is. And then in the app module for AngularJS in the constructor, you are going to add the upgrade module and then just tell it to bootstrap the document body. And then Angular seed is the name of our AngularJS main app module. And you're basically, then that will tell it to bootstrap. The ng.downgrade is going to be covered here in a second. And this is the alternative way of re-enabling strict dependency injection if you're using that in AngularJS. The ng do bootstrap, that is just a no-op piece of code that's just needed so that the bootstrapper doesn't complain when you start adding things. So let's try this out. So as you can see, the application is still currently running, so that's good. I'm going to open up a new tab here. And so in step 3, I cover kind of what I did to make the build process work automatically with the existing grunt process. I'm just going to run ng build -- watch in a separate tab, and just so that way I have grunt watching and building AngularJS, and then I have the Angular CLI building Angular. And I should probably be in the correct directory when I do this. All right. So we're going to make just a few minor changes. So first thing is we are going to make one change to the index.html file. So there's these 5 bundles that are loaded, and so it's important to note that the order of the bundles matter. So you're going to have to import the inline bundle, the polyfills bundle, the styles bundle, the vendor bundle, and the main bundle. This is also a dev build, so by default the styles are bundled into a JavaScript bundle. The default for production build is the styles are put into a CSS file, so keep that in mind with whatever you're going to be using for your build tools to inject in these different bundles when you actually do your real builds. Then so at the top here, we have the ng app, and this is where we originally instantiated AngularJS and our enabled strict dependency injection. So I'm just going to remove all that, and that's basically all I'm going to do here. So now you get to see the application break. So what's happening here is Angular is loading, and it is looking to bootstrap the app component, which doesn't exist, and because I haven't in the index.html, there's nothing telling something to bootstrap. I don't have any selector there, so nothing's basically happening. So I'm going to go into the app module here, and that's the wrong one. All right. Let's make that a little bigger. Okay. So we're just going to go to the app module. You're just going to add a simple constructor, and we're going to use call this upgrade. So we're using the upgrade module. It's added from Angular upgrade /static, and that's important. If you look at older guides for how to bootstrap Angular, you'll see some alternative ways of doing it. We were actually originally bootstrapping Angular from the main.ts file. If anybody's already done a hybrid application, just keep in mind if you're bootstrapping from the main.ts file or within the ng do bootstrap method, you will likely have issues if you're trying to upgrade an AngularJS component or service. So then within here, I'm going to just look up what I did. I'm sorry. So basically what we're going to do is you import the upgrade module, and then you call this.bootstrap, the document body, Angular seed, and that, as I said before. Body. I'm going to forego the strict dependency injection just because it's not necessary to work. And then you have to call this ng do boot. Actually, first I need to add the upgrade module, and then this should come up. Nope. Well, looks good to me. Not sure yet. Well, we might need to just skip over. Oh, sorry. Need to declare this as a function. So with that, our app is built. You need to remove the app component from the bootstrap here. We're not using it right now. It will be used later. So now when we refresh, we are actually running a hybrid application now. So it is now using Angular alongside AngularJS. Just kind of a simple matter of adding in the files you need and just kind of changing some things around in the order of operations for how you are bootstrapping. Modifying the build process, like I said, I'm going to just kind of gloss over this for this talk, but I go into detail in the guide. But basically, I'm using grunt injector to wire up the Angular files, just kind of using some logic. There's a different process for the dev and prod builds. You're going to run into the issue of building in prod mode with the Angular CLI. It's going to generate a CSS file or Sass file of all your bundled CSS if you're using the main style directive in the Angular CLI config. And then I just wrapped the ng build watch command in, I think it was faithful exec is a grunt tool that you can use. You can just use a script. It's pretty easy to integrate it in. It runs asynchronously, so that's one thing to keep in mind is you might start your build and eventually it takes a little bit of time doing the build this way, but eventually it'll show up and the bundles will get created. And then once it's running, the watch is very fast and changes are picked up pretty quick. So I will just show you real quick. All right, so when we run grunt after modifying the build process, basically everything happens as before. The command runs there, but you don't really get any feedback that it's waiting to build the Angular application, but it will happen eventually. So you see the chunks were rendered there. And so now if I go into my Angular app, and let's just say I add comment here, it detects a change, builds it, and then things get updated. So downgrading an Angular component. The process for downgrading and downgrading an Angular component and downgrading a service are fairly straightforward. They both kind of use the same logic. For an Angular component, though, you need to be explicit with any inputs and outputs that the component uses. You need to redeclare those when you downgrade the component, and you also have a little bit of a difference with the casing that's used and the attributes you have for those inputs and outputs. You'll need to use the Angular types, TypeScript types. It's listed in the README for one of the things that's installed when you need to merge everything from the package.json file. The types are an additional thing. Those aren't automatically included with the Angular CLI. And then I'll show you the syntax you use to use the Angular variable within Angular. And so let's just say you have an input and a component that's called this test input. When you declare it in TypeScript in Angular, you're going to call it TypeScript using camel case. When you use it in AngularJS, it's test-input. So you have to use kbob case when you use it there. You also need to use some different notation depending on how the variable is used, which I'll cover here in a second. So you'll see here on the left we have just a simple component. It's just a hello world component. It has a test input. We declare a test input here. So this is just basically saying it's a string. And then so when we downgrade this, we use the declare var Angular. It's just the syntax that you use to declare the Angular variable. And then you have to create a new module that you're going to include in your, when you bootstrap AngularJS. Any modules that you create, you have to include. I create just a single module, which I put all of my downgrades into. And then when I bootstrap AngularJS, I just include that ng2.downgrades module, and then I have access to them in AngularJS. So you call downgrade component, you tell which component it is downgrading, you declare the inputs as an array of which inputs that the app uses. In this case, it's just test input. And then you call as .I directive factory. So if you're going to be downgrading a service where you see that .directive, you would just include a .service, and then you can just chain those together for as many as you have or are downgrading. In the guide, I go over in detail downgrading one of the components. It's a little too verbose to kind of go into here. There's a lot that had to be rewritten. So, but a few of the kind of gotchas that I'll go over are what I'll go over for when rewriting and considering what you're rewriting for migrating over to Angular. So one of the main things that is a little bit different is the bindings that are used in Angular versus AngularJS. With Angular, you have, or with AngularJS, you have one-way binding. So if you're familiar with the component tree or using components in AngularJS, you use a less than sign for showing for one-way binding. In Angular, it's just brackets, just two brackets. For two-way binding or for outputs or function callbacks in a component, you're going to be using the ampersand in AngularJS. In Angular, you use the just two parentheses, or just parentheses around it, and that's basically binding an output. And then for just string binding, you don't use either. And then for two-way binding, Angular has, for the most part, if you use two-way binding in AngularJS, you likely don't need two-way binding in Angular. They call it the banana in the box syntax. I'm not going to be going into detail here about that, but just keep in mind, if that's what you're looking for, that's how it's used. You have the brackets outside of the parentheses, and kind of a fun thing to remember is banana in the box, or in a box for using that. You're also, so when you specify, when you're writing the CSS for Angular components, when you're doing it in like AngularJS, you might specify the component name or call an ID that's attached to the element or the class. With Angular, it has a notion of just specifying a host. So when you write CSS for a component in Angular, it's bound directly, it's scoped directly to that component you're writing it for, and so you can just reference that main component element with host. And then so you say host, and then everything below that, you can then use more specificity as needed as you go down there. So let me just bring up, so now we're using the new build. I'm going to go. All right. So I'm going to let that build here. So another thing to note is that when AngularJS, at least it might be a common thing that you're using ng-repeat and iterating through an object and its properties. In Angular, it doesn't have a default pipe for iterating through object properties. You can iterate through arrays, so maybe the best solution for most scenarios like that is you just convert the object into an array and then iterate through that using ng4. In this case, I just wrote, just kind of for fun to see it be done, a object pipe. So I basically reintroduced the ability to iterate through an object, object's properties, and display them using an ng4 in Angular. I also added it in there. So the format there is the value that of the object that you are iterating, and then I added another variable to what you can pass into the pipe called exclude. If there's any keys I want to exclude from showing up in the iterator. Just kind of something fun to do. And then pipes. So you might be wondering, you might have heard that pipes in AngularJS are not the best thing to use when it comes to performance, especially if you're using it in a large ng repeat, or they just basically, the problem with pipes in AngularJS is that they are executed on every single change detection. So they're what Angular refers to as impure pipes. With Angular, the default pipe is a pure pipe, and basically a pure pipe is only executed on a pure change to an input value that pipe is watching. So, and that's primitive values, so strings, numbers, booleans, or symbols, or an object reference, such as a date, array, function, or object. So pipes are kind of back now. You can actually leverage them in a better way than you could leverage in AngularJS. So what I'm going to do now, oops, wrong screen. So right now I'm building, I have the app open with everything that's been rewritten. Let me minimize this here. So what you'll see if you go through this, again, like I said, I need glasses, so I'm sorry. There we go. So everything's been decomposed heavily into different modules that are used here. The file info card is one that I rewrote here. And basically, so if you look through the code in the AngularJS code, there's no notion of classes or really object-oriented programming that's kind of heavily used in AngularJS. So everything's been decomposed here into just calling a class called file info, and iterating through that object in the template to then show the changes. And those changes are what you see down here. So when I refresh the page here, and I go down here, list of files, compare a file, this little component here is an Angular component. So it's been downgraded. I create this downgrades file here to kind of bundle everything I'm downgrading. And so you see here, the component name is acid file info card. So I'm going to reference that in AngularJS with kbob case, so acid-file-info-card. Then you specify the component that it is that you're downgrading, and then the input, I just had file info as an input. And then I include this downgrades, or I import that downgrades in my app module, and basically that will include everything that I am downgrading. So just do the import downgrades, and that's just kind of one way to decompose that out. But what I mainly wanted to cover here is the ability to add an Angular route. So basically what we have now is we have the ability to downgrade components and services and use them in AngularJS. You could also upgrade an AngularJS component or an AngularJS service and use them within Angular. I don't have hard examples of the problems I've come across. I just have come across some issues that I feel the best way is to just rewrite things in Angular and then to downgrade them as needed, or better yet, just rewrite entire routes to use all Angular so that you kind of have separated out your app. I also go over, so one issue that you'll probably come across is that you have a header maybe on your site that's static throughout the whole page, and then you have a content area and then maybe a footer. So I use UI router in AngularJS, and so I was able to basically just say, load the header, load the UI view for the main content, and then right above that, as you saw in the index file here, where is it? Not that one, but this one. So basically what you do, oh, this is the wrong branch. All right. So basically what you do is you have the body tag. So then I just put my header here. This is my Angular root app component. Within that, it's just a simple UI router call. And then below it is just the UI view for the main content. So basically what happens is you make AngularJS aware of routes that you want to use as Angular routes. You make Angular only aware of routes that it should be looking for. And then once Angular detects a route it should be looking for, it then uses the router module to find out which component or whatever it is that you're displaying on that side. So I will show you how that's done. So there's a few things. One thing I noted when I was doing this, I wasn't able to get this to work when I was using HTML5 mode with UI router. So I had to disable that and kind of change the way that and started using the hash prefix. So you might notice in earlier ones, earlier versions of the app, there was not this shebang up here, but I need to build the app first. But basically, using the HTML5 mode didn't work. So I needed to tell Angular to the URL strategy to use, to not use HTML5 mode. And then you also need to tell it kind of the format of your URL. So again, if you had maybe Angular as a side part of the rest of your main application, you might want to tell Angular at what point to start recognizing routes to be looking for. So you want to provide, so this is the app base ref, so you can declare that here. I'm just using the root as my base app ref. You can also declare this, I think, in the HTML tag. You need to specify a location strategy. That's basically saying we're going to use the hash location strategy, which is not HTML5 mode. And then also we need to implement an Angular or a URL handling strategy. And that just basically says these are the URLs we are going to accept, and then we need to tell it how to handle them using the router module. So in this URL handling strategy, I just have two routes I define. One is hello world, and another is just undefined Angular route. So Angular has this notion of a wildcard route, which is basically a catch-all for matching any routes. It's not really going to be used too much when you're running this hybrid application because you need to individually specify each route that is going to be passed on to Angular. So by doing that, basically your wildcard routes are going to be managed by AngularJS until you move everything over to handling routes in Angular. So what then you have is this app routing module that's declared here. I have a wildcard route that I use to kind of show the example that's done. I'm importing my other routes, basically just using for more routing modules. But basically what you need to do, it's important that when you call your routes, your wildcard route needs to be declared after all of your other routes. So if you are decomposing it like this, or you're going to put all your routes into the routes constant, the wildcard route needs to go last, otherwise it will immediately match the first route it looks for. The other thing that you want to keep in mind is, so in AngularJS, I created this Angular routes module here. And this is where I basically tell AngularJS, these are the routes I want you to ignore. So I believe with the AngularJS router, you don't need to use this empty template syntax. I think you just basically say, do nothing for this route in a little slightly different way. I believe Victor, how do you pronounce Victor Savkin? I believe he has a write-up on using the Angular router with this. With UI router, you basically just say, declare a state that you're never going to use, and then the URL that's going to match. And then you just need to say, to show an empty template. If you don't show the empty template, it's just going to show white on your page because the UI router is going to take precedence, show a white page, and nothing will happen. You want to show just an empty template. That way, the Angular then will take over. So basically what's going to happen is you enter a URL into the address bar. So I type in hello world. It goes to the AngularJS UI router. It finds that route and then displays a template. At the same time, or an empty template. At the same time, Angular is the URL handling strategy says, I have a match for hello world. That just means, okay, I'm going to now kick in the router module and look for if I can handle this route. So I have in the hello world routing module, I have that. There it is. So I have this routing module here. And then this says I have this path hello world. So that is the match I'm going to use. And so then it says, OK, we have a match. Load the hello world component. So if I didn't have this path specified here, but I did have it specified in the UI router, and then I had it specified in my URL handling strategy, but then I had no match for any route in the router module, and I did not have a wildcard route specified, you'd get an error saying there's nothing going on, like it doesn't know what to do at that point. So I load, so you see here now the hash bangs are loaded at the end of the bar, at the address bar. This route is written completely in Angular. And then so you'll see here though, if I were to change this to, I'm matching this. So basically this path is now impossible to get to because I haven't specified this path in the URL router as a match. So you'll never get to this path in Angular, but if I still go to the old hello world path here, it is going to look for a route, but since I had the wildcard route, it loads my page not found component. So, oh, it's telling me to update. So if I go back to app routing module, so see here I had this wildcard route. So now if I remove that wildcard route and now try to load, you'll get this big error here because you told Angular that it should match this route and you didn't have a route specified for that. So something to keep in mind if you're trying to start implement what's kind of shown in the guide. And again, the guide has heavy detailed steps each part of the way, as well as you can look at the Git diff that I linked to for kind of what was done. So we covered this. So this is one thing that Mike brought up with what you're going to run into with running a hybrid application, hybrid module. First, is there any questions at this point with using the upgrade module, with specifying Angular routes versus AngularJS routes, downgrading a component or a service? All right. So one issue you'll run into if you're using Angular material and you run a hybrid application is a digest is triggered every single time you move your mouse. So basically in AngularJS, if you're trying to avoid a digest triggering, you want to register things outside of AngularJS. And so you do that by just registering native JavaScript handlers. So Angular material has a few event handlers that it registers. One of them is for mouse movement. One of them is for mouse clicks, scroll bar, other things like that. So basically what happens is those things that it wrote to avoid digest cycles is now triggering change detection and triggering a digest due to the way Zone.js monkey patches all of these event handlers. And so there is a sort of a way around it. One way around it is, it sounds like with this upgrade light method that's going to be coming out, you'll kind of avoid this problem altogether due to the way that you're doing it. I found a way to do it basically by, in your app.run block for your main AngularJS application, you loop through all of the event handlers that have been registered against your application. You whitelist the ones that you don't want to trigger digest cycles, and then you register those outside of the Angular zone that the app is running in. So you register them in the parent zone, and then you re-register all the other event handlers back into the zone that they were in, the Angular zone. Might sound kind of weird, but where am I? Here I am. So basically what you have here is, just load the correct, yeah. So I have this. I have the code block I used to do this. The one thing you want to keep in mind that if you are running, if you're running uglify or minification on your vendor files in AngularJS, you're going to likely have issues matching these function names because they're going to be obfuscated. So We found that we were able to, our bundle was small enough that we didn't mangle our function names because we're using grunt uglify. So we didn't mention the mangle the function names, and yes, and then we were able to basically make this keep working. So on the left side you can see it, the issue happening, and on the right side you can see everything working just fine. Lastly, just kind of worth mentioning, this is an example of what you'd do if you wanted to upgrade an AngularJS service. You specify the provider with that syntax, basically specifying the GitHub API, that's the name of the service in AngularJS, and then, or which you just kind of best practice just to match the two. You're telling it to use the injector as a dependency, and then when you inject it, in order to leverage dependency injection, you need to use this syntax here. You call @inject, the name of the service, and then just give it a variable name. So at the end here, there's a bunch of links for different sources of information I found. Two very useful ones. I have two Plunker templates up there with using System.js to run a hybrid application. One of them is just a basic one with just kind of showing I am bootstrapping Angular with AngularJS, or AngularJS with Angular, and the other shows how to use the UI router and how to bootstrap that. And that's what I have. So are there any questions for any part of this? Question. Yeah?
Under what circumstances are people downgrading?
Under what circumstances are people downgrading?
Yeah, AngularJS.
You mean like downgrading a component or downgrading a service? So one example is we have a footer that we had in AngularJS, and we wanted to leverage that footer. Basically, we wanted to kind of rewrite our entire, be able to show entire routes in Angular without eventually leveraging this UI view thing. So if we have a native footer, a native header, our entire route can basically just be an entire Angular page with no AngularJS code involved. So we upgraded. It's kind of one of those things where if you have something that you want to write, you have new code that you need to write, but you still need to use it in AngularJS. So we still need to use our footer. We don't want to maintain two versions of our footer if it's not needed. So we rewrote it in Angular and just downgraded it in AngularJS and use it in both places. Another example of that that's more relevant is just if you have you just have one of the pages that you're using, like an admin page or a user page. It's something that eventually needs to be rewritten in Angular if you're going to be doing the conversion. But there's no reason to maintain two copies of it. So it's really, if you want to rewrite something and start doing that kind of piecemeal, moving things over, you can then start doing those, rewrite them, and then just display them in AngularJS if they're needed. Especially if you have reusable components. I mean, because you can leverage all the type safety of TypeScript. You can't, I don't want to say you can't leverage RxJS from Angular, but my experience with it doesn't work that well. But you just leverage kind of all the benefits of Angular that you can then get by downgrading it. So you can kind of write things that are more maintainable and easier to test. Would you like a patch? All right. All right, thank you.